So I'll just say 3, 2, 1, and then my voice will change slightly into something more kind of upbeat and hi and welcome. No, so okay, so 3, 2, 1. Hey, Carl, thanks so much for coming on to chat to me today. How are you getting on?
Very well, Robert. Thank you.
No worries. So listen, the reason I wanted to chat to you today is in relation to, I suppose, what people would refer to as imposter syndrome. How this came about for me in terms of a conversation and something I thought was worth having is I'd spoken to a creative person a couple of months back, and as part of the conversation we had for another podcast, he had spoken a little bit about kind of the challenges that he faces in creating content and posting them and what goes through his mind. And some of the feedback that we got from people was, oh, it's great to hear people talk so openly about that. So that got me thinking that maybe there was people out there who thought the same way as a lot of other people do. And I basically just wanted to have a chat with you about it, a little bit about the psychology that goes into it, and maybe ways that people can kind of focus on it and get around it. So, I mean, from your experience going in, what is your kind of background and what is your kind of experience towards this kind of thing?
I have a pretty broad background when it comes to engaging with imposter syndrome. I actually wrote my PhD on the creative persona and how we determine that through biographical text. And actually an awful lot of what we understand about the kind of creative persona is based on, even in the field of psychology, has been based on biographical text. Now we would say you absolutely don't use that as a source because it's constructed, it's culturally constructed. So we have this perception of what a creative should be. So that's just a sort of an insight into my background on it. In terms of how it manifests now and how I deal with it now, I lead the creative and cultural entrepreneurship course in Trinity. I've also worked with creatives for a long time. I am a creative. I paint, I write, I make music. I've engaged with imposter syndrome myself. I coach people who deal with it every day, and not just in the creative field. And this is something that I think we will have to address, is that there's a huge amount of myths that grow up around, that have grown up around what the creative is and how the creative is more emotional or more inclined towards mental health challenges than maybe people in other fields. That's not the case. The research absolutely shows now that there's no sort of prevalence of mental health challenges specific to creativity. The one thing that does seem to come up quite often in the research is that creatives may be exposed to other people who have mental health challenges, specifically affective mental health challenges like bipolar disorder, but they don't necessarily experience that themselves. And that's been repeatedly shown. So in the context of imposter syndrome, it's something that I meet a huge amount of the time, but not just in the context of creativity. It's prevalent through entrepreneurship. So yeah, it's something, as I said, I have a huge amount of engagement
background
with.
in.
Yeah.
And in terms of it being prevalent outside of not just creatives, but in terms of entrepreneurship, I understand it from my perspective dealing with it, and I mean, as I'm assuming a lot, I like to think that most people think the same way. But like, you mean, my thing would be, you know, you create something, or you might go so far as to create something, but then you're not necessarily quick to show it or share it with anybody. But in terms of from an entrepreneurial side of it, and that is it the same sort of mindset? Is it basically just this inability or fear of sharing? From an entrepreneurial perspective, I'm very interested in what is it that what's their fear? What, from that perspective, is it just trying? Is it pushing yourself? Is it kind of, is my business worth anything?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose just to outline what imposter syndrome is, it's the belief that there's no value in what you've produced, and you try to rationalize your achievements by almost explaining them away based on things like luck or sort of people liked me as a person, but not necessarily the quality of my work, or, you know, all of these different things that come into play. And that has the capacity to sort of permeate through both the creative field and the entrepreneurial field. But there are people sitting at desks in companies all over the country, all over the world, who experience this. And I think your own sort of thinking there, in that other people are experiencing this too, other people's mindsets are, you know, a feature in this game. The process of building something and putting it out into the world to be criticized, you know, in entrepreneurship, we talk about ugly baby syndrome. Nobody likes to pour themselves into a product and then have somebody deconstruct that product or negatively criticize it. Because we tend to think of these products as extensions of ourselves. That is something that I do see quite a lot in the creative field. So I would have lectured in fine arts for a few years as well. And there's this constant pressure to create something original. But originality is a myth. It's an absolute myth. We exist, and just to sort of switch to the academic parlance, we exist in an intertextual nexus, which essentially means we're constantly being influenced from so many different directions, and quite a lot of the time we're not aware of those influences. So we have the perception of originality, or at least being unique. And this is sort of, when we think about what we produce, there's almost like a sort of a mandate of what it needs to be considered creative or unique or viable as an entrepreneurial product. And usually originality is a feature of that. And certainly in the creative space, originality is something that's considered to be a selling point of your work. But originality is a myth. It's, you know, you can only create something original if you're essentially live your entire life in a vacuum, you know, with absolutely no exposure to anything else. And even then, you know, the likelihood is somebody else will have already done it. So there's this constant pressure to perform a certain way, and this certain way isn't reality. And, you know, if you're producing new products as an entrepreneur, if you're producing art or if you're producing design, and you don't consider yourself to be original, because imposter syndrome is about you. It's not about what other people say about you or how they critique you. It's your response to it. If you believe that you should be original, then you're setting yourself up for a fall straight off. And that's
yeah, because I generally that's 100%, and I generally find that even when you don't sorry, I apologize about that dog.
You never apologize for a dog. Dogs are always welcome.
He's had some surgery and he's not himself the last couple of days. But the thing I find with, say, the originality aspect of it is that sometimes you might say to yourself, well, I'm not original, and you might draw inspiration from something, but straight away you're comparing yourself to what inspired you, which automatically puts you on well, it's not as good as that. So you find yourself in this thing where, you know, so if you're not going down it has to be original, it's never as good as what it is I'm comparing it to.
So one of my favorite examples that illustrate what you're talking about, on the last course, you know, we've 80 students on this course. We had a guy who has a PhD, who lectures, who is a fantastic conversationalist, who is super, super smart, and is a writer, but isn't a writer in his mind, because he compares himself immediately to Joyce, to Kafka, you know, the sort of
the Everest
the absolute
of
elite.
Yeah.
And you're kind of saying, well, you do realize that, you know, I use the analogy of football. I said, I like to play football. I'm not Ryan Giggs. I'm not Eric Cantona. It doesn't make me any less of a footballer. You know, somebody playing for Bows isn't any less of a footballer than somebody playing for United or, you know, Real or Juve. They still are. It's just there's a spectrum within this. And what you're talking about there as well is, you know, drawing influence. In the context of imposter syndrome, there's 5 divisions. There's the perfectionist, there's the sort of the super person, there's the natural genius, and that's something where originality is a feature. I might hit on that. But there's the soloist, which is what you're talking about, the expectation that everything I should produce should be produced only by me. And if I'm influenced by somebody else, then that kind of devalues me in that space, and therefore it's not my work. And again, this is the flawed thinking around create something original. And I used to get students incredibly frustrated coming into me from other classes with other lecturers, and they're like, I'm being told constantly to create something original. And my bigger issue is where students believe they're original, go out into the world, and then have somebody go, oh, that's exactly like, because they don't know the scope of the history of art, for example, and they haven't engaged with that particular field. I'd prefer for people to be comfortable with engaging with influence, and recognize their value of influence and seek influence, and dismiss the idea of, you know, I need to do this on my own. I need to be 100% present. This is you know, and we talk about literature, we talk about the sort of the omniscient author, you know, who has total control over the narrative. It's a myth.
Yeah, it is. like to use me as a personal example, right? I will oftentimes, like, it's funny because it's very rare, like depending on where you're, say from a creative aspect, depending on where you're, or even from an entrepreneurial standpoint, depending on where you're sharing the work that you do, most of the time it'll be greeted with either someone will like it or indifference. It's very rare that somebody will come out and be like, well, what you've created is terrible, or what, unless of course you are, you know, you're putting yourself up to like film critics and things like that, and you're making a commercial piece of art that's to be reviewed, and that's a different kind of mindset, because there's a I suppose an economic side to that, and people are trying to make money and they're being paid for their opinions. But generally, day to day, when you're creating content you're sharing, and most of the time it's either greeted with indifference or acceptance. It's very rare that somebody will come out and be like, listen, what you did was crap, especially if it's a stranger, unless, as I said, it's a reviewer part, or you're going down weird rabbit holes on the internet where you're sort of inviting that sort of behavior, because you do have people who will do that to a degree.
There's probably something that we probably needs to be defined there. It's not necessarily other people's response to your work that determines whether you're dealing with imposter syndrome or not, because if it's somebody else's response, you will dismiss positive responses and say, oh, well, they just like it because of me, or they just like it because they just happen to like that specifically, or they just like it because, you know, they clicked like and it didn't really matter, they were indifferent in reality. But you will find ways to explain away your achievement. And that's a big feature of the imposter syndrome element. You know, and I think what you're saying is really important, especially now, more so than even in the past, because we're exposed to so many opinions. But when we talk about imposter syndrome, we kind of have to be conscious as well that there's an impersonation element to it. You feel like you're impersonating somebody else. So I often get, when I'm talking to people, you know, about how they're responding to criticism or feedback, it's like, who do you think you're impersonating? I suppose this kind of goes back to as a writer, do you think you're Joyce? As a filmmaker, do you think you're Gus Van Sant? As a musician, do you think you're Chopin or Kurt Cobain? You know, what's your frame of reference for what validates you? And it's important for people to sort of recognize that, you know, even in sport, you know, I fight, that's my sport. Who do I compare myself to in that space? And, you know, am I in any way capable of meeting those ridiculous,
lofty kind of ambitions,
aspirations and ambitions? So, but you see work now that's posted online. It's very rarely representative of the work as it hangs on the wall. You know, this is part of the performative and the presentation element of it. So are we comparing ourselves to a real competitor? And then do we respond to the feedback based on this? Do we, you know, but I think it's important that we recognize that imposter syndrome sort of lives inside of us rather than being
an external factor
factor,
so it's driven 100% by you and your opinions, rather than what, and the opinions you do garner from people, you will inevitably twist to suit whatever that inside voice is telling you. So go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, you could show me the most incredible piece of work that you've produced, and I can sit there and have a full critical understanding of it, a genuine interest in the piece. It could be, you know, in conflict with my preference, but I still see and I can talk to you and give you really good, very positive feedback. But if you're engaged with imposter syndrome at the time, you'll find a way to shrug that off. You know, as quickly as, you know, and it's not necessarily that you'll engage with the negative quicker, you'll just find a way to dismiss it because it's completely internalized.
Because I've worked with students myself who are so crippled by an idea that people won't like what they do, that they either don't create anything or they slave over things to a point where it becomes debilitating, where they're, you know, I got to reshoot this shot over and over and over again, and it's a simple thing and they've already gotten it like 10 takes ago, and like, I got to get, because there's some reference point in their mind that they're trying to match. And I know that there is, you'll hear stories out there, and you'll talk about your Stanley Kubricks of the world with their 300 takes and their whatever, and that's their particular approach to thing. But that's not the way everyone's mindset is. And I find that some people are so crippled by it. And I used to, when I studied, say, film, and I worked with students, the class was always split down the middle. There was that class who, like, there was the guys who went out and the girls who went out and shot something, right? And then dealt with the fallout of that. And they didn't like it, but something inside them forced them to go on. And then there was the counterweight to that, which was the students who just couldn't do it. They just couldn't get beyond whatever it was. And then when they completed something, they wouldn't show it to anyone. And, you know.
So, I mean, if you compare, say, Elia Kazan, who allowed a huge amount of freedom for actors on a set and sort of gave ownership over scenes and setting scenes and the acting in a set, to the likes of a Wes Anderson, who has got almost total, like, militaristic presence in all of his work. He is like the definition of the orator. You know, he's constantly present in delivery, in the writing, in the shooting. You know, even his engagement with designers are perfectly positioned to facilitate his vision. One is neither better than the other. You know, he may reshoot, like Kazan may look for that, you know, unique, original moment in the scene. You know, Brando putting on the glove while he's sitting on the swing and on the waterfront, I think it is, you know, completely outside of Elia Kazan's ownership of the film. You know, students are told at times, and I do see this, that you have to have angst. You have to, you know, struggle with this. There has to be difficulty for you. You have to be neurotic to make a good film or create a good painting or create the best songs, you know. But this is something that we kind of tend to see as being replicated repeatedly into biographies and the celebration of a particular type of artist, because culturally we prefer our creatives to be a little bit left of center and a little bit disturbed. But there's phenomenal graphic designers sitting at desks every day of the week, get up in the morning, go and create phenomenal work. I mean, David Carson is one of my favorite graphic designers. I mean, there's not a huge amount of evidence or narrative around him really struggling and having to sort of externalize this internal angst. Some of this is preference, and who do you want to replicate? And, you know, if you look at, say, even actors, you look at, say, James Dean from 1953 to 1955 became the kind of the stereotype, the prototype, or the kind of the template that other actors should model themselves on. And if they weren't angsty, if they didn't have that, well, then were they really an actor? You know, were they? And you see that with artists. I mean, one of the points that I used in my research was that, you know, Jackson Pollock changed his name to Paul because it sounded more like an artist's name. The guy, you know, I mentioned in an earlier conversation with you, the enacted biography, you know, validating your work based on the persona that's attached to it. And you may spot that the first take is perfect, but if you're not seen to agonize over it and do it 200 more times like Kubrick, then is it really good art? You know, are you really the orator, or are you just a tradesman who's, you know, shooting a film?
Yeah, I remember. I know that. I just want to stick at that because just when you say about multiple takes, I cannot remember the director. And I'm going to butcher it. It was a famous director from the 60s, and he would only shoot, you know, his wide and his close up, and they would say, "Hey, do you want any more takes?" And he'd be like, "No."
Yeah.
The more I shoot, the more work I have to do. Do you know what I mean? But I suppose it's reaching a level like that. But I suppose what's interesting is if you take, we're sort of talking about two ends of a spectrum where you're saying you're either in, you know, when you're a creative, and I feel like we're talking about from the perspective of you're producing art, and then you mentioned a graphic designer, and I'm wondering, how does that mindset shift when you take a creative and you put them in a professional environment? Because suddenly your measurements are now, it's no longer, you know, sometimes you don't have the time to agonize over something, and because you're working to a deadline, or you're trying to earn money, you're trying to earn a wage from it. So I'm wondering, does that attitude, when you start mixing the business and the creative together, how being dictated by wages and times and deadlines in that capacity changes it?
So there's a huge amount in what you've asked there, a huge amount. And I get quite frustrated with the myth of the creative, because again, it's grown up through the classical period. Vasari has a lot to answer for, writing in the 1500s. Michelangelo actually has a lot to answer for as well. The reality is, we have what we call now a growth mindset, the capacity to move into different spaces and do things in different ways. People have preferences, absolutely. There are people who are working in offices, who are working in the financial sector, who are working in tech, who would have all the same personality manifestations as somebody who considers themselves a creative, as in somebody who paints, or somebody who makes music, or somebody who directs films, who doesn't want to be sitting at a desk from 9 to 5, you know, who doesn't want to be wearing a suit, who doesn't want to be going to business meetings and doing that sort of stuff. The difference for me a lot of the time is the academic path that these people have come through. Creatives, so on fine arts courses, you're surrounded by other people who have no aspirations necessarily to sit in an office. That's reinforced because the people who are lecturing you are reinforcing that, that ideology. So it's this sort of conditioning as much as anything. We're conditioned to perform as creatives as much as we are to feel like we're creatives, because there are people who feel like creatives and sit at a desk. And there's an author whose name I can't remember at the moment, who says, I'm struck by inspiration every morning at 9 o'clock when I sit down at my desk to write. You know, and
yeah.
There's a huge amount of myths around creativity that have been with us for a long time and are ingrained in culture. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at, say, the likes of a George Lose back in the 60s, who was a designer, a graphic designer, or a Saul Bass, who produced incredible work, but he produced it to sell. He produced it within a sort of a time frame and a format that made business a financially viable avenue aligned with the creativity. In reality, I mean, you talk about filmmaking. I make videos for music. The vision at the outset is probably the creative aspect. But when you spend hours looking at Premiere Pro, stretching something or shrinking it, or, you know, tweaking it slightly by a second here or there, that's a technical skill set. It's not necessarily a creative skill set. The technicality might inform the creative outcome at the end, but it's quite often people on the other end who aren't creative or haven't studied any of the Adobe stuff, who will look at this and go, wow, it's incredibly creative. But you know, you've spent a huge amount of hours doing technical work, not necessarily creative work.
Yeah. But sometimes there is, and then sometimes the flip side of that is you create something, and then when you go to the technical side of it, you discover something else. You literally create something else from that. But again, you don't know that. But the downside of that is, it's like that fixes and post adage where someone says, you know, if you expect creativity in the technical side of it, you're in trouble. Do you know what I mean? Because you need to go in with some sort of mindset that you're going to create something, and sometimes it's not even a mindset that you want to create something. Sometimes you just have this burning desire to get what's in your head out, be it in a painting, be it in a film, whatever, and whatever technical side of that might change. And then when you get into the filmmaking process as a commerce thing, it becomes different, because then you've got the original creative idea, and then that becomes dictated to by other people along the way. And one of the things about, say, the technical side, I do an awful lot of technical post-production work for other people. So I take other people's stuff and put it together. And for me, it's joyous, because I feel I'm detached from the creative side of it. So I feel I'm handed a bunch of stuff that I had no say in the creative element of it, and my job is to put it together. So it eliminates any mindset from me that you know, oh, nobody's going to like it. Oh, it's not great, because for some reason it's detached from me, because I feel like I'm putting together someone else's art, and I am very much structuring meat and bones type person. And the end result, be it liked by the audience or not, doesn't land on my shoulders, because my job was to assemble somebody else's art. So it's actually a process I really enjoy. But then when you ask me, say, to create something, I'm filled with all that same sort of stuff. And I will ask, I mean, I will ask for constant validation from people around me. What do you think is, what do you think of that? And even if I get solid validation, I still won't share it with people, on the off chance that, I don't know, you know, on the off chance that it won't look right, or the information in it won't be correct, or I don't know. And it's a strange sensation, because part of you thinks that everybody out there has conquered this, and is anyone who's sharing their art and their work has figured it out. Do you know what I mean? And a lot of times I look at people and I think they're doing it, and the detachment for me, as an example, would be, is I can't see that my reaction to their work would be their reaction to my work. Just doesn't commute, it doesn't connect, there's something missing.
I tend to think imposter syndrome is one of the most peculiarly egocentric experiences, because you immediately focus on you and your feeling about it, and forget that there's other humans around you who are. There's a belief now that imposter syndrome affects roughly 75% of the population, and even calling it a syndrome is kind of misrepresentative of the broader engagement people have with it. That it is, you know, pretty prevalent. And yeah, I mean, I tend to think that one of the ways to sort of deconstruct it is to get people to think about the fact that other people experience it. Other people have all of these sort of insecurities. Of course, they're not going to walk around and introduce themselves to you and say, hey, how are you? I just put a piece of work up, and by the way, I'm terrified that people are going to respond negatively to it. So, you know, and then you kind of go, oh, me too. That's not a conversation people generally have. but actually trying to facilitate whereby people have that conversation, has the capacity to sort of remove imposter syndrome or reduce the feeling of imposter syndrome, where we're making it clear that people, again, it's because we pour so much, and actually creatives tend to produce a lot of products. If you think of them, you know, a film as a product, or a video or a song as a product, all of them are individual products, whereas entrepreneurs tend to produce one or two here and there, you know, so it's putting the one out and having to get that feedback. Seeking validation, I don't see a problem with that. You know, in the context of it came up again in a course recently. You know, we ask people, why are they here? This is working with creatives. You know, what are you looking for? What are you hoping to achieve? Quite a lot said, look, I want to get to a space where I'm making money. I say, okay, great. One person said, I need validation. You know, but I shouldn't need validation. Say, well, let's start there. If you feel you need it now, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does that give you moving forward? But asking people for feedback and validation, that's not necessarily a feature of imposter syndrome, and the unwillingness to share the work isn't necessarily a feature of imposter syndrome. That can be self-esteem, that can be shyness, it can be professionalism to a degree. Now, a higher level, you know, perfectionism is a feature of the imposter syndrome, the range of feelings that people have in there. But there can be other things at play that are stopping you from doing that. The other thing is, one of the big areas that I engage with creatives around is how they price their work. You know, if you put your work out there, somebody's going to say, well, how much is that? And then that's like, let's just dig a big hole and jump into it, you know, doing everything they can to avoid it. Because if you feel like you're an imposter, then adding a value to that almost concretizes the fraudulence that goes along with being an imposter. And
you inevitably end up sort of, like, as I said, my partner is a hairstylist. She has been for years, but she would also devalue her work, and that's an art in and of itself. And she would also devalue her work. Sure, it only took me this amount of time, or because it's something it's because it's something you enjoy doing, you don't associate it with work, and you're like, I don't mind, I'll put it together or whatever, I'll do it, and that's fine I find from the perspective of when you're not doing it as a professional, or you're not doing it in a professional space. But the minute you move into professional space, trying to allocate a price or a value, and it's not just your work, it's your time, and that's something that people don't seem to connect.
There's something you said in there which sort of triggered me a little bit. The fact that we enjoy creating what we create means that we don't seek, you know, financial remuneration for it. As you mentioned, your partner, mine is in the other room. She's a scientist, absolutely loves what she does, like loves it. More passion for what she does as a scientist than 90% of artists or creatives that I meet. And that's the same because I've met her staff on evenings out and things like that. And they're all super, super passionate about what they do. And they all get paid a huge amount of money for what they do. So they skip into work, even on rainy days. Like, I mean, there's excitement from the night before about a new project. I mean, so again, these are the sort of things we need to deconstruct. Just because we enjoy what we do doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't get paid for what we do. So that's one of the things we need to go, okay, get that out of our vocabulary straight away. You know, in terms of then how do we charge for what we do? And, you know, while feeling like an imposter, I mean, I love the line, what's your budget for this? It's great. But again, it's not just creatives who are paid with exposure. You know, an awful lot of entrepreneurs are invited to give talks at events, or, you know, can you come and facilitate this workshop? Or can we bring your product into our space, and, you know, we'll prop one up over here and get people using it. Sure, we'll take photographs and it'll be great. And people, so the kind of the pay element as it relates to imposter syndrome exists in a lot of different spaces. It's just that people don't talk about it as much as they do in the creative space.
And it is funny because the creative space is the only space that I know of where there's almost an expectation that people would pay you in exposure, if you know what I mean. So
I can guarantee you that that's not true.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I can 100% because my own experience, but also the experience of other people who are entrepreneurs and are asked to do. I see this quite a lot because I coach a lot of SMEs.
Yeah.
And they're, you know, saying, what do I do? They've asked me to come in and they've asked me to, you know, run this event, or they've asked me to do this or that. But they're not talking about money. They haven't mentioned money, and these are big companies that are inviting people in the business space, not as creatives. And the expectation is that, you know, if you're early stage, or a very basic example, a guy I'm coaching at the moment, who probably won't hear this, so I'm saying,
Yeah.
a mechanic essentially, given a sort of a generic, but he's essentially a mechanic, setting up a new business, and is struggling with the idea of what do I charge, because I'm only new in this space, even though he's been working in that particular space for about 20 odd years, but he's setting up his own venture. People have said, look, what we'll do is we'll bring in a few bits and pieces, you'll fix them, we'll talk about it, we'll, using the language of exposure. I don't know if there's anything more distant from creativity than being a mechanic or an engineer, and that's the sort of, but I see it in the entrepreneurial space so often. It's just that it's something I kind of want to make visible, but because it's not something that's discussed in the entrepreneurial space, there's the expectation that it's responded to with like, no, they're just griping, I mean, look, you go into business as a graduate, the vast majority of people do internships.
Yeah.
So they work in there for free, which is essentially a process of exposure. Whereas graduates coming out of arts degrees or fine arts degrees as creatives are either going to go to work for themselves or work in another field and get paid. But there's, it's a little bit abstract, but an awful lot of people are expected to work for exposure and for free in a lot of different spaces. It's just that it's not talked about quite as much as it is in the creative space.
Yeah, no, that's because and that's, I didn't know, because from my perspective, I'm always looking at in these Facebook groups and things like that, where people are saying, listen, I have a film shoot coming up, I need a cast and crew, but I don't have a budget, I can't afford to pay you. We'll work for a show reel, all that sort of stuff. And you could gradually see over time that people were kind of like, listen, advertise it's unpaid or advertise it as paid. But again, that's my bubble, I suppose, in the exposure, the world that I'm in, that I see, and you can see people saying, well, why? And the conversations that pop up are, why is there an expectation that we would do these things for exposure, do these things for free, and all that sort of stuff. So my assumption then, from being exposed to this single narrative in the bubble that I'm in, is that is the way it works. But I mean, if it's yeah, I mean, maybe it is just a case that people talk about it more. I don't know why, but it could be, maybe it's because people who are being creative are then devaluing themselves a little bit as opposed to someone else, and they're saying, maybe this sort of stuff shouldn't be paid for, or maybe, I don't know. So I mean, I suppose it's two different mindsets.
Up until 5 years ago, I would have 100% agreed with you that it was a problem specific to the creative space. Now that I work in a lot of corporates, now that I work in a lot of different companies and coach an awful lot of people starting businesses, I see that it's much more common than I'd originally thought. But it is a more open narrative in the creative space.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
I know, it's funny. I've done events, I've done public speaking events with the expectation of exposure. And again, I've chased for photographs from the event and things like that, because with the absence of pay, that is a currency in and of itself. And without even getting that, then you find yourself kind of, well, what value did I get from that? And I suppose there's got to be value from everything you do to a degree.
I use an example. So I was in bands for a few years when I was younger. I made more money taking money at the door than I did playing music. A promoter, because they liked me, because I was presentable, because I fit the brand at the time, would say, look, can you come in and take money for us at the other gigs? I say, yeah, no problem. I get paid for that, but I never got paid for playing gigs. And there was far more financial investment in rehearsing, buying equipment, all that sort of stuff. But the only money I would have really made from music was busking, or from taking money at the door for gigs. It's a system that's in place, that there's an expectation that people should do things. And the reality is, in other fields, it's not questioned, and it's not understood, and it's not explored.
Yeah, so it's strange. I mean, even when you say taking money at the door, I mean, my background is in festival management, and first day, I always wanted to study film. First day in film school, within 20 minutes, they were talking about the sponsorship side of it and the raising money side of it. And I was getting really excited, and I was like, I don't want to make films. I want to, help people make films. So I moved into the producer side of it. And then I want to run an event, because that's kind of where I'm more interested in. But I also looked at again, maybe it ties into some sort of feeling about myself. I also straight away was like, there's more creative people in this room, and I would rather help facilitate their vision than have them help facilitate mine. And maybe there's a commerce side of it, or maybe there's a business side of that is not being taught in the class I'm in, and that's something you focus on. But that's more, I suppose, leaning into that's, I don't know, being fatally realistic about what you can do, or not giving yourself a chance straight out the gate to say, maybe I could create. And I have shot films, I've shot music videos and stuff like that. It's a process I really, really enjoy. I love when you're in it. I love it when you're working with a crew and everybody's working together and everything's going great. It's great. It's just all the doubt and stuff that comes afterwards, which, to be honest with you, slows the process down. Have you had and you say 75%, have you had students who've come in and have just been like, I don't, yeah, it's grand, I'll just create and share and move on, and they're just, yeah.
That's my mindset. I have this weird performative switch. I don't know if I learned it through years of martial arts and competing at like international level, where you just step on the area and that's it, you're fighting, and you have to leave everything outside of it. And I have this really nice ability to kind of switch myself off from criticism hurts everybody, you know, especially because sometimes we feel it's personal criticism rather than a constructive criticism to improve the music. But there's students that I work with who are just so proud of everything they do, you know, incredibly proud of everything they do, think it's incredibly original, which I always think is a bit more of an obstacle. I think, you know, you don't want to crack the enthusiasm on the way to supporting a more rounded engagement with their field, because generally if somebody thinks that they're fantastically original, it's just that they don't have a depth of knowledge that supports a greater level of awareness. But you got students who walk in and they just want everybody in the world to know what they do, and they have total faith in it, and they've no problem getting up and singing in front of people. They've no problem in performing. They've no problem in showing their work. They're, you know, it's just out there.
Do you find that that number decreases over in the sense, I'm saying, do you find that younger students coming in would be more open to the idea of sharing their work and things, as opposed to sort of do you think it might be a sort of a generational mindset that'll change over time, I suppose is where I'm getting at? Or
so there's a few things there. We don't fully develop until we're in our late 20s. Our prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop, and that's generally what is responsible for impulse control, which one of my theories is that's why so many young people have changed history, because they haven't
thought it through. It's fire out there.
But I think you mentioned something earlier which resonated with me as well. An awful lot of younger students that I'm working with now are just mentally sort of hamstrung by the fear of sharing something, because you're probably close in age. I'm 40. You're probably in your 30s. Hope I'm
not far off. No, I'm coming up behind you.
All right, fair enough. Yeah. Good. When we would share something when we were younger, or when I would share something when I was younger, or when I play a gig, it was literally the people in the room. That was it. If I shared a painting, I always hated going to exhibitions that had my painting in them because there were more people, but I still did it. Now if a young person under 20 shares a piece of work, it's global. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
I'm working on a project at the moment with the Disability Services in Trinity, and they have a co-op group of young students, and one of them is fantastically creative and makes films capturing the stories of other students and what they're experiencing. Up until she started working with us, she would make them, put them on YouTube, and that was it. But we've really pushed her to share these because there's a currency to it. It supports the goals of the of that group. But now her work has gone from being seen by maybe 10 people to being seen by hundreds of people and being seen by maybe thousands of people. I share her work. So it's seen in universities all over the world. That's great when somebody's sharing something that's really positive and it's got a nice message, and nobody's going to be particularly negative about students talking about their disabilities. But if you share something that's maybe controversial, or if you share an opinion that's not with the kind of the mainstream ideology, then the response to that is visceral, and the response to that is global. And it's not just one person saying, don't know if you should say that, or a lecturer saying, listen, I think we need to err on the side of safety. It's cancel culture kicks in, you know, it's total shutdown. It's, you know, and I know you mentioned like some people will either click like or they'll be indifferent to it, but it depends on the kind of work you're producing. And it depends on, you know, who takes a disinterest or a dislike to you. So,
no, that's fair enough. What I meant earlier on is because I often think about my internet bubble, and because I always think I always think like Twitter and the internet has a room and everybody's talking, and my room is full of, my room is full of kind of shy creatives who, hey, do you like my work? Hey, what do you think of my work? What do you think of my work? And occasionally in other rooms, I can hear people shouting pure venom and rage and bile. And occasionally those people drift into my room and they kind of give out and they talk. But I can imagine that, and sorry, the response to that is the output that put out in that room is quite positive. It's quite, I would never express an opinion. I would never express, because I just don't think my room is the space for that. But I would imagine that if your room was one of those inhospitable terrains, putting something in there, expressing an opinion, a piece of art, you invite that whole mob mentality culture, which is an extremist of, you either really, really love something or you really, really hate something, and no one in the middle of the room can be like, I just think it's okay. Do you know what I mean? You've got to have that. And I can imagine that would be incredibly daunting for somebody to want to share original art or anything that expresses something.
But I mean, you and I don't know how far behind me you are. I'm not a digital native. So my world construct, my schemas that are in place are designed based on the fact that if I do something that's crap or terrible or that's, people don't like, it's probably two people who are going to tell me, whereas digital natives, so people in their 20s, millennials, Gen Y, Gen Z, they're all kind of coming up with the global response. And I see this actually in seminars, and a couple of other lecturers have said it to me in seminars, that students are terrified to give their opinion because, again, it's not just the other people in the seminar. The expectation is that the response is going to be much, much bigger. And that can be, and it's not imposter syndrome. That's a viable fear. And there's an anxiety
and it is
attached to it.
And the worry there is that, I mean, a lot of over history, a lot of conversations have come from art and the art that people created, where they've challenged ideas and they've challenged things. And the fear there is that not only will people not express opinions verbally, but then they won't express themselves through art. They'll try and toe the line, and you'll end up with this kind of thing where wherever I was joking today, I was saying Demolition Man is probably the most spot on depiction of the future ever.
I only agree because I only watched it the other day, but my other half had never seen it. And I've been saying for the last few months that Demolition Man is a much more
accurate
specific representation
than
1984, which is what a lot of people are talking about. And
it is. Down to the culture, down to the you cannot swear, even
the handshake.
Even the handshakes, even the scene in it where they wear the headsets, all that sort of stuff. But it's kind of a really extreme. It's an extreme representation of a future you don't see. Normally, you see like a really extreme version of the right hand side where it's all kind of totalitarian, whatever. It's an extreme version of that, and it's aged incredibly well. But there's a fear then that, I can imagine that you're an artist and you're like, well, I don't want to express an opinion, or worse, you just won't have opinions on things for fear that you'll.
Well, look, I mean, there's a peculiar kind of dichotomy in play at the moment whereby our expectation of negative response is very, very high. But the reality of the negative response is people saying they don't like your work quite a lot. Whereas if you look at the 1940s, if the Nazis didn't like your work, then your work was gone. You were potentially gone to a gulag or to, that was a pretty extreme response.
Life and death. Yeah,
that was real cancel culture. And so there is the difference in there that we need to be conscious of. But there's I think an increase of a third of students now registering with mental health challenges. There's an awful lot of evidence to suggest that that's got an association with digital culture and with the kind of the anxiety that grows up around that. So there's an awful lot in play. And then you mentioned the kind of the shy creatives. I know a huge amount of creatives. They're not all shy. There's, I've been working with 80 recently on a course. I've lectured to hundreds across a range of different courses. I could probably pick out the ones who fit that stereotype.
Okay.
I could comfortably, whereas, maybe it's what I do in the room that makes people comfortable. Maybe because I deconstruct the performative element of it, the enacted biography, we should be creative. We should be introverts. We should be withdrawn. And these are sort of manifestations that happen when we try to fit in with a group more so than being specifically representative of who we are as individuals. There's the introversion, the extroversion, the ambiverts in between. There's no and this is anecdotal because it's purely my experience, but I certainly have seen students who are creatives, absolutely won awards for being creative, who definitely don't fit the shy reclining model of introverts, you know.
Yeah, and I know some as well who would, and you'd often look at them and you'd marvel at their sheer confidence, and you'd be, but I mean, they just don't have that. They just don't have any, maybe the same limitations or the same yardstick to beat themselves with that I would or somebody else would in the class. It's just like, it's not good enough, and they're just like, yeah, it's great, or you know what, it didn't work out the way I thought it would. Kind of roll on to the next project. And
you know what I find fascinating about that? So what you're talking about there is kind of almost iteration, you know, the failing forward element. And as creatives, every time we start something, it doesn't begin perfect on the page or on the screen, and we edit it, and we pick from a series of different shots that we've done, and then we put the best ones that satisfy our goal most. That's all a process of iteration. That's all a process of trial and error. And yet we put that in a very specific space in our process, and then forget about the value of that, and then move into total perfection, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas if we maintain the mindset of iteration, and just sort of the sense that, well, it doesn't have to be perfect today because we can refine it and get it better and better and better as we move through other stages of our process, then there will be far less of the sort of the anxiety and the stress. I find that because it's something I see quite a lot of with students on the different exercises that I'll get them to do, that they want perfection on day one. I say, but at what point in your creative process have you ever had perfection on day one? No first brushstroke on a canvas, no first shot that's filmed is the final product. You know, there's always more added. There's things
refining and retuning and
iteration completely right the way through. And yet there's this expectation or this belief that something should be perfect on day one. I just find that it's like when I coached kickboxing for years, people come down, expect to be able to do a jumping spin and heel kick from day one. If they can't, you're like,
and then if people can't, they give up, or they don't have that. Sometimes they don't have that thing. Oh, well, I'm not there. I've happened to myself. I did martial arts years ago, did judo for a while, and I was like, I couldn't do a bunch of stuff within the first 2 or 3 weeks, and I just was like, what's the point? Do you know what I mean?
Because you know, there's so many phenomenal creatives who are not being creative because of that fear of not being perfect from day one. And I just do not understand that. I don't understand why anybody would expect to be perfect on day one.
I mean, hopefully hopefully that changes over time. Just because I am what would you say to anyone who's listening right now who's just kind of like, well, I don't want to create something, or I don't want to share, or is kind of, what would be your kind of, I don't mean to distill it down to simple advice, but just a mindset, a way to look at things and say, step outside that current train of thought and think differently.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it's always, look, what is the benefit of sharing for you? You know, if you share this and go big with this, look for the benefits, look for the positive elements in this, because the reality is we build up the negative. Our brains are predisposed towards being loss averse and negative. We see the risk. That's part of our genetic makeup, our sort of evolutionary echoes. You've probably heard you see a bush shaking as a sort of prehistoric being, and you think, it could eat me or I could eat it. Yeah. And our brain will always go with, it could eat me, let's get out of here. Yeah. So we're pre-designed in that way. Critically engage with what's the risk. You know, what is the genuine risk of me sharing this? People might not like it. So what? People might say it's not particularly well done. So what? It's the first one I've done, or it's the second one I've done, or they're going to get better, or some people just don't like things. We need to have these mantras prepared in play. And then the other side of it is the benefits. What are the benefits to me sharing this? This is the first step in my process. Bukowski talked about, you only know you're a writer when you're getting rejection letters. Otherwise, you're just a person sitting at home. You know, a real writer submits work. So it's about the benefits, you know, and in any business. And this is tricky for students as well, to get them to think of being a creative as being a business venture. The first step in any business venture is creating awareness. So I reference it very often. My mother used to say to me, nobody's going to knock on the bedroom door and ask you if you want to be an actor. Nobody's going to knock on the bedroom door and ask you if you want to be a musician. You know, you have to sort of buy the ticket and, you know, take the ride. I think it's Hunter S. Thompson, maybe he said that. Yeah. But look for the benefits and write them down. Be really strategic about this. Get them down, get them visible, get them on the wall beside you. But this is part of a process. You know, it's not something that you're going to crack on day one, and your brain will find ways to convince you not to do the thing you want to do. We love being in the comfort zone. We love that safe middle. Well, if I don't put anything out there, nobody's ever going to really tell me I'm crap at what I do. So we get to sit in that nice space of potential. Oh, I could have been a phenomenal filmmaker, but I never really got my chance.
Yeah.
Well, you did get your chance, you just didn't take it. You designed the world to. So it's about, I mean, I always say, because I, you know, my PhD's in creativity, I lecture in it. The first step to being creative is to be creative. It's to do something. Mm-hmm. It's to start momentum, get your work visible, get it out there. But it's a process, and it is going to be difficult, and expect that it's going to be difficult. You know, expect that you're going to have challenges with it, and that's okay as well. It's perfectly okay to not feel immediately comfortable with putting your work out in front of people, because that's not because you're creative. That's because you're a human being. And that's the same in, you know, I work on graduate courses in corporate spaces. I coach in the executive level. Right the way up, people have a fear of failure. People have a fear of being found out. That's the imposter syndrome element. People want to generate and put out new ideas, but status management is in play. Oh, I don't know how people are going to respond to this. Don't know if this impacts my status if it's not right. Does that then devalue my role in the team? This is not just creativity. This is human. And I think when we get people to recognize that these aren't just features of the creative persona, then we get to step out of that shadow, because it is an obstacle. Because the expectation is to be a real creative. You know, if you talk about in film, then you have to be a Kubrick, a bit eccentric. You have to be a James Dean in acting, you know, or a Johnny Depp now, who I just think is shocking. So much potential. You have to be that sort of extreme. If you're going to be a writer, you have to, you know, be like, obviously I've got my preferences, but there's a sort of a value based on the persona that validates the art. And that's just not true. That's just people selling. That's the people in the business side of the creative field selling the work. It's, you know, it's the myth of the creative persona, this sort of expectation of melancholy. I mean, I use Michelangelo as an example. He used to destroy his preparatory sketches to give the impression that the work was fully formed. This is the sort of the Kantian idea of immediacy and genius that goes along with creativity. That, you know, the sort of the innate skill set. Francis Bacon destroyed a lot of his early work to give the impression that his masterpiece period was the only work he ever produced.
Yeah. I often see that. There's people, I even see that, like, even on a social media print, people go and they archive, like creatives go and they archive their older stuff, their older images, their older films and stuff like that. And because they're growing and they become, I don't know whether they become embarrassed of their previous work or whether they want to present themselves as a specific level. So they then archive and get rid of stuff so it doesn't exist anymore.
This is in alignment with the myth of the creative being an instantaneous and immediate genius. That's where that comes from. Because I always use the example of Botticelli. You know, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Primavera, that kind of gorgeous, gorgeous works. That was a tradesman going to work. That was a guy who you could also hire to paint your canopies. You know, but over time, there's a fantastic essay that I reference. It's called the Van Gogh Effect by an author named Natalie Heinrich, who sort of deconstructs a lot of the sort of the myths that grow up around what a creative is and how we celebrate. And, you know, this is getting a bit sort of academic, but you know, that inversion from the sort of the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern, that binary inversion, it was traditionally felt that all creativity was divinely inspired, that it all came from God. Then when Van Gogh came around and we came into the likes of the work from Freud, who sort of shifts that binary, your creativity has to come from the hardship you've experienced in your life. So what you have are people who have never really experienced hardship scrambling to find hardship, and promoting that and biographers are a big culprit for doing that. And you see it with Andy Warhol, who was actually, by comparison to a lot of his peers, was quite well off as a young person. He was one of the only families that owned their own home and things like that. He would go out and buy expensive clothes and then rip them up and, you know, tarnish them to look like he was
maintain that illusion.
You know, Pollock did the same pretty much. You know, he would have intentionally splattered his clothes with paint to let people know he was an artist, wore a cowboy hat to kind of exemplify his you know, Wild West upbringing, even though he didn't really have one. You know, it's
Sure,
something
it's good solid marketing.
But that's exactly what
It's
it
like
is. It's
Bruce
marketing.
Springsteen's the same. Bruce Springsteen has
Yeah.
built up his entire, I cannot, whatever the word, sorry, built it up on being this kind of hard living, middle American kind of thing, and he's not. I don't know where he's from, but he's not from thing. But yeah.
I say, you know, while I don't particularly like his art and I don't like his business model yourself on Damien Hirst, you know, not Mark Rothko, because Rothko is more of a myth than Damien Hirst is. Hirst is, okay, he's sued on a regular basis for plagiarism, but he has an Irish business manager. He makes an absolute fortune. You know, it's not built on the myth of the sort of the Dionysic sort of artist who's all emotion.
Yeah, well, that's perfect. I'll leave you get back to your day anyway. I could talk about this all day long, but I also have this wee chap who's getting louder and louder.
Take care of the dog.
Yeah. He's trying to get my attention now. But thanks so much for chatting. It's really interesting, and I'm hoping that people really kind of motivates them, or not even motivates them. It kind of clears up some people's mindsets a little, and helps them kind of think a little bit more about what it is they're doing, why they're doing, and the value they're getting from it, and not the value they perceive other people will or will not get from it. Yeah.
Oh, and look, I mean, there's resistance to the type of thinking we've been talking about, because some creatives do like to, you know, hold on to the stereotype, and some people are in that space, and that's fair enough. But it doesn't have to be your brand. You know, it doesn't have to be the selling point. Your work is the selling point.
Perfect. We'll leave it on that positive note. Thanks so much for that.
Lovely. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks.